In 2026, one of the world's most influential newspapers, the New York Times, published a report that shocked Nigeria. The report claimed that United States President Donald Trump relied heavily on information and reports allegedly provided by an Onitsha-based screwdriver trader, Emeka Omeagbasali, founder of the civil society organization Inter-Society, in shaping America's understanding of mass killing and insecurity in Nigeria. The article further stated that this report helped influence U.S. government actions, including military responses linked to airstrikes in Sokoto state. In one sweeping narrative, a Nigerian market trader, a civil society activist, a U.S. president, and a military action in northern Nigeria were placed in the same casual chain. But beneath this dramatic framing lay serious problems: misrepresentation, selective attribution, ethnicization of national tragedy, and weaponization of journalism for political purposes. Tonight, 1010 Media investigates how a screwdriver trader in Onitsha became linked to the U.S. military decision, why the New York Times focused on the Inter-Society while ignoring dozens of other reports, how Nigeria's APC-led government exploited the narrative for political survival, and why this story threatens Nigeria's unity, democracy, and national stability. This is not about journalism. It is about power, truth, and the cost of misinformation. The 2026 New York Times report alleged that during Donald Trump's presidency, the United States officials relied on documentation and advocacy from Inter-Society, a civil rights organization based in Onitsha, in framing Nigeria's security crisis, particularly allegations of mass killings of Christians and communities in northern Nigeria. The article implied that this advocacy influenced diplomatic pressure, international policy posture, and ultimately contributed to security decisions, including airstrikes operations in Sokoto state. The framing suggested a powerful idea that a Nigerian civil society activist, who also happens to be a screwdriver trader, was central to shaping U.S. government policy, that American military posture towards Nigeria flowed from market-level activism, and that the Onitsha-based organization disproportionately shaped international narratives about Nigeria. But the facts tell a very different story. What the New York Times did not emphasize or fail to contextualize is this: Inter-Society was not alone. Multiple Nigerian and international civil society organizations published reports on killings, displacement, religious violence, and insecurity in Nigeria during that period. Church bodies, human rights groups, security think tanks, international NGOs, diplomatic missions, even Nigerian-owned institutions. In fact, the United States government did not rely on civil society source. It dispatched a special U.S. envoy to Nigeria on direct instruction from President Trump not to receive advocacy brief, but to conduct independent fact findings. That envoy submitted a report based on field investigations, embassy intelligence, security briefings, and diplomatic assessment, not on inter-society publications. There was also a report by Nigerian current INEC chairman, which independently documented patterns of violence and insecurity. These multiple independent streams of information directly contradict the suggestion that one Onitsha-based activist or organization shaped U.S. military posture. Yet, the New York Times story foregrounded in society. Why? Let us be clear. Emeka Omeagbasali is a civil society activist. He is also a trader. Neither of these facts make him a policymaker. Neither of these facts make him an intelligence officer. Neither of these facts place him in US military decision rooms. And civil society reports, no matter how strongly worded, do not authorize airstrikes. Governments do not launch military operations based on NGO publications. They rely on intelligence agencies, diplomatic cables, military assessment, security data, embassy reporting, allied briefings, on-ground security evaluations. To suggest otherwise is negative journalism. It is narrative distortion, and worse, it personalizes what is fundamentally institutional decision-making. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the New York Times framing was not the factual error, but the symbolic targeting. Instead of presenting Nigeria's insecurity as a complex national crisis involving banditry, terrorism, governance failures, intelligence breakdown, border insecurity, arms proliferation, poverty and displacement, the story narrowed focus onto an Igbo trader, a southeastern civil society activist, an Onitsha market figure. In doing so, the narrative subtly transformed a national security crisis into a regional controversy, a governance failure into a personal story, a humanitarian tragedy into an ethnicized dispute. This is not journalism. This is narrative engineering. The framing became politically useful because the APC-led government was under intense international pressure over Nigeria's insecurity, allegations of religious persecution, and civilian casualties. Instead of addressing these failures directly, a new storyline emerged that the Nigerian international image crisis was not caused by insecurity, but by activists, not by violence, but by advocacy, not by governance failures, but by propaganda. And suddenly, the problem was no longer killings. It was reporting. It was no longer violence. It was the documentation. No longer insecurity. It was foreign exaggeration. The New York Times story gave political actors a powerful tool. They could now see this is not about insecurity. It is about one Igbo activist misleading the world. This reframing allowed the government to dismiss legitimate human rights concerns, avoid institutional accountability, politicize security failures, ethnicize national tragedy, redirect blame onto civilians, and most dangerously, to fracture national unity. Perhaps the clearest evidence that this was never about truth, but about narrative control, was the Nigerian government's decision to spend $9 million of public funds on a US-based lobbying firm, not to fix insecurity, not to compensate victims, not to reform intelligence, not to protect civilians, but to counter narratives of Christian persecution and mass killings. Instead of addressing violence, they paid to manage perception. Instead of reforming security, they invested in reputation laundering. Instead of confronting tragedy, they outsourced denial. And then, rather than engaging civil society constructively, the government narrowed its counter-narrative to one man, one trader, one activist, one organization, one region. This is not crisis management. It is scapegoating. Nigeria is not just a state. It is a delicate federation of histories, identities, and trust. And trust collapses when national tragedy is ethnicized, when insecurity is blamed on regions instead of institutions, when policy failure is blamed on civilians instead of systems, when advocacy is treated as sabotage, when markets are treated as threat vectors, when activists are treated as enemies. The New York Times story and its domestic exploitation created a dangerous implication that Igbo traders and Southeastern civil society actors were responsible for Nigeria's international embarrassment. This is not only false, it is incendiary, and once insecurity narratives become ethnicized, national unity becomes collateral damage. Civil society exists to document injustice, advocate reforms, amplify victims, hold power accountable, strengthen democracy. Civil society reports do not weaken nations, they strengthen institutions. When governments choose accountability over denial, the problem was never inter-society. The problem was never Emeka Ume Agbalasi. The problem was never advocacy. The problem was violence. The problem was insecurity. The problem was governance failure. And no amount of narrative manipulation can change that reality. If activists can be blamed for military decisions, then journalists become enemies. If traders can be blamed for foreign policy, then citizens become suspect. If advocacy becomes sabotage, then democracy becomes treason. If documentation becomes hostility, then truth becomes illegal. This is how authoritarian information culture begins, not with tanks, but with narratives, not with arrests, but with scapegoats, not with censorship, but with delegitimization. Responsible journalism requires collaboration, balance, context, proportionality, evidence, and institutional sourcing. The New York Times failed in all six. It overstated the role of one civil society group. It ignored multiple independent reports. It minimized official U.S. fact-finding missions. It personalized institutional decisions. It ethnicized a national crisis. And it indirectly legitimized scapegoating narratives. This is not investigative journalism. It is narrative distortion. Behind the story is a man, a trader, an activist, a citizen, a Nigerian. And now, globally, he is framed as a catalyst for international military action, not because of wrongdoing, not because of criminality, not because of extremism, but because he documented violence. This is character assassination by implication, and no democracy should tolerate it. Center media exists to defend Nigerians from dangerous narratives, not through propaganda, but through truths, not through tribalism, but through national interest, not through emotions, but through evidence. This story is not anti-America. It is not anti-media. It is not anti-government. It is anti-misinformation. It is anti-scapegoating. And because truth matters, and unity matters, and accountability matters. If Nigerians accept the New York Times story, they accept ethnicized insecurity. If Nigerians accept the New York Times story, they accept narrative governance. If Nigerians accept the New York Times stories, they accept scapegoating over accountability. If Nigerians accept this New York Times story, they accept democracy without truth. And once citizens accept that, institutions become untouchable and nations become fragile. This story was never about a screwdriver trader. It was never about inter-society. It was never about Emeka Ume Agbalase. It was never about Onitsha. It was about a government struggling with insecurity, a political class desperate for narrative control, a media environment vulnerable to distortion, and the ease with which truth can be sacrificed for convenience. Donald Trump did not base military decision on Nigerian trader. US government is not shaped by market stalls. Airstrikes are not authorized by civil society reports. Governments make war decisions, and when those decisions fail, they must be accountable, not civilians, not activists, not traders, not regions, not ethnic groups. Nigeria deserves better. If you believe Nigeria deserves truth, not scapegoats, if you believe civil society deserves protection, not prosecution, if you believe insecurity must be solved, not politicized, if you believe unity matters more than political survival, then subscribe to 1010 Media. Share this documentary, comment your thoughts, because silence allows dangerous narratives to survive, and 1010 Media refuses to be silent.